Ethan was a quiet man, the kind of man who could walk through a crowded hall and go almost unnoticed. He was tall, but never carried himself with pride. His words were few, his tone gentle, and his eyes often lowered. People thought of him as nothing more than the soft-spoken husband of Queen Alara. To them, it was just a shadow standing beside her throne. Queen Alara was the opposite of Ethan in every way. She was bold, proud, and spoke with a voice that filled every corner of the palace. She was loved by the people for her strength and her beauty. She ruled with sharp words and confident steps. When she entered a room, all eyes turned to her. She enjoyed the attention, and she enjoyed the whispers that followed. Next to her, Ethan looked small, a quiet figure who never seemed to belong in the same light. The nobles noticed this difference, and they whispered about it often. They called Ethan weak behind his back. They laughed when he walked past. They wondered why a queen like Alara would tie herself to a man who had no fire in his words. Even in the great hall, when the queen held council, many forgot he was even there. One evening, during a grand gathering in the palace, Alara stood tall before her court. Her gown shimmered beneath the light of the chandeliers, and her crown caught every sparkle. She spoke of the kingdom's strength, of how they would never bend to any rival. Her words burned with power, and the court cheered her on. Beside her, Ethan stood silent as always, his hands folded, his eyes lowered. Then Alara turned her gaze on him. She smiled, but her smile was sharp, meant to sting. She asked him in front of everyone why he never spoke, why he never showed courage like a man should. The room went still. The nobles leaned closer to hear. Some smirked, already knowing the queen's tongue was about to cut deep. Ethan raised his head for a moment, but he said nothing. His silence filled the hall more loudly than any words could. Alara let out a laugh that rang against the stone walls. She called him timid, saying even the smallest bird had more voice than her husband. The court laughed with her, their voices rising like cruel music. Ethan did not answer. He only lowered his eyes again, his face calm, as if the laughter had not touched him. The night went on with feasts and music, but the sting of the queen's words lingered. Servants carried trays, nobles clinked their glasses, yet whispers followed Ethan everywhere he stepped. Some pitied him, but most mocked him. They could not understand why he stayed silent, why he never raised his hand to defend his honor. Ethan left the hall before the music ended. He walked alone through the long corridors of the palace, past tall windows that showed the moonlit gardens outside. He did not weep, and he did not grow angry. His heart was calm, but his mind was awake. He had heard every whisper, felt every laugh, but he carried it, as he always did, with silence. Behind him, the celebration carried on. Queen Alara danced with nobles who praised her strength, never noticing the emptiness that followed her husband's steps out of the hall. She thought him too quiet to matter, too soft to ever change the course of her reign. But in the stillness of the night, far from the laughter of the court, Ethan's eyes were not weak. They carried something hidden, something sharp that no one had yet seen. For now, he chose silence. For now, he let them laugh. But silence is not always weakness, and a quiet man may carry more strength than a kingdom ever imagines. The next morning, the palace was filled with restless talk. Servants moved quickly through the halls, carrying news of trouble near the borders. Farmers had seen strange banners in the distance, and traders spoke of armed riders moving through the valleys. By midday, the rumors reached the throne room. Queen Alara listened with narrowed eyes, while the nobles around her argued over what it meant. Some said it was nothing more than wandering raiders. Others believed it was a rival kingdom preparing for war. Voices clashed in the air, each noble trying to sound wiser than the other. Alara raised her hand to silence them and declared that no force would ever threaten her reign. Her words were proud, and many clapped in agreement. Ethan stood quietly near the throne, his hands behind his back, his eyes fixed on the floor. Reports were brought in by scouts who had ridden through the night. They spoke of enemy forces gathering beyond the hills, more organized than raiders, more dangerous than passing thieves. The council grew uneasy, though most tried to hide it. They looked to the queen for answers, but she only spoke of her generals and their strength. She dismissed the fear with a laugh, saying the enemy would tremble at the sight of her banners. Through all of this, Ethan remained silent. He had listened carefully to every report, to every small detail others ignored. He noticed the way the scouts' voices shook, the way their eyes held something close to fear. He caught the mention of strange movement along the river, a detail most brushed aside. He knew these signs meant the danger was greater than the council believed. Yet when he stepped forward and began to speak, Alara cut him off with a wave of her hand. "You worry too much," she said with a smile that was sharp enough to wound. "Let the men of war handle this. We're not made for battle." The nobles laughed, echoing their queen's scorn. Ethan lowered his gaze again and stepped back. His words died in his throat, but his thoughts did not fade. He carried them with him as he left the council chamber, walking alone through the stone corridors where no one followed. The whispers of the nobles trailed behind him, mocking his silence, mocking his presence. As the day passed, the mood of the palace grew darker. More scouts returned with reports of riders closer to the heart of the land. The fields near the river were burning, and villages had been abandoned in haste. Now the generals met with the queen, drawing maps, moving markers, and speaking of strategies. They spoke with great voices, but little certainty. The truth was clear to Ethan, though he kept it within himself. The enemy was already too close. In the great hall that evening, the queen hosted a feast for her nobles to show her strength had not faltered. The tables were heavy with food and drink, yet unease lingered in the air. Music played, but it could not drown out the tension in every heart. Some nobles whispered that the enemy might strike within days. Others said the queen's army would crush them before they reached the gates. And through it all, Ethan sat quietly at the queen's side, listening to every word, every whisper, storing it away in silence. Once more, Alara turned to him before the gathered nobles. Her voice was playful but cutting. "Tell us, my husband," she said. "Do you have wisdom for us tonight? Or will you hide in silence once again?" The laughter of the court followed, sharp and cruel. Ethan met her gaze for a moment, his eyes calm, his lips closed. He gave no answer. The laughter swelled and then faded as the music began again. When the night was over and the guests had gone, Ethan walked through the quiet halls alone. Outside the windows, the moon hung over the dark fields, and in the distance he thought he saw the faint glow of fire. His heart was steady, but his steps were heavy. He knew what was coming, even if no one else wished to see it. The queen and her nobles believed his silence was weakness. But Ethan carried in his silence a truth that none of them could yet understand. The night was restless in the palace. The air felt heavy, and even the torches on the walls burned lower, as if they knew what was coming. Guards moved along the corridors with quick steps, whispering to each other about the strange silence beyond the walls. The city slept uneasily, not knowing how close danger had already come. At dawn, the warning bells rang. The sound cut through the palace like a blade. Servants dropped what they carried, nobles rushed from their chambers, and soldiers gathered their weapons. From the high towers came the call no one wanted to hear. The enemy was at the gates. Now Queen Alara stood in her throne room, her face pale but proud. Her generals crowded around her, shouting orders, drawing hurried plans on maps that no longer matched the reality outside. The enemy had struck faster than anyone expected. Villages near the walls had already fallen, and smoke rose in dark pillars against the sky. The palace shook with the roar of horns and the clash of steel beyond the walls. Soldiers scrambled into formation, but their fear showed in every movement. The nobles who had laughed the night before now hid their worry behind trembling smiles. In the chaos, Ethan stepped into the hall. His calm face stood out among the storm of voices. He asked for a blade. The hall grew still, for no one had ever heard such a request from him. A few nobles laughed nervously, thinking it a joke. One of the generals smirked and muttered that the queen's husband wanted to play soldier. Alara looked at him with disbelief, as if she had not known the man beside her all these years. But Ethan's voice was steady, and his eyes were firm. He repeated his request. A guard, uncertain, placed a sword in his hand. The weight of it rested easily against his palm, as if it belonged there. The laughter in the hall died down when they saw the way he held it, not like a stranger to steal, but like one who knew its language well. The attack came swift and brutal. Enemy riders broke through the outer gates, their cries echoing through the streets. Arrows struck the palace walls, and the sound of battle thundered closer. Soldiers rushed forward but without order, their fear making them weak. The generals shouted but gave no clear path. Confusion spread like fire. Then Ethan moved. His steps were calm, but his presence cut through the panic. He spoke with a voice that was quiet yet commanding, telling the soldiers to hold the lines, to use the narrow passages where the enemy numbers would count for less. At first they hesitated, unsure if they should follow him. But when he raised his blade and stepped into the fight himself, their doubt turned to action. In the courtyard, Ethan faced the first wave of intruders. His blade moved with a skill that stunned all who watched. Each strike was clean, each movement precise, as though he had fought 100 battles in secret. He cut down those who dared come near, not with rage, but with control, his calm unbroken, even as blood stained the stones. The soldiers, seeing his strength, gathered behind him. He shouted clear orders, guiding them to form shields together, to drive the enemy back step by step. Where the generals failed, Ethan brought unity. His quiet presence became a force greater than the noise of fear. For the first time, the defenders pushed forward with courage. Inside the hall, Queen Alara stood frozen. She watched through the tall doors as her husband fought with a power she had never imagined. The man she had mocked, the man she had called timid, now stood as the wall between her kingdom and ruin. Around her, the nobles whispered in shock, their laughter from the night before silenced. The clash of steel rang through the day. Smoke and cries filled the air. But wherever Ethan's blade shone, the defenders held strong. The enemy pressed hard, yet they met a spirit they had not expected. Ethan's calm voice and steady hands turned fear into strength. The queen could not look away, her heart heavy with a mix of fear, awe, and shame. By the time the sun began to fall, the first assault had been beaten back. The enemy retreated to the hills, leaving their dead at the gates. The kingdom was wounded but still stood, and at the center of it all was Ethan, his sword lowered, his eyes quiet, as if the storm had never touched him at all. The smoke of battle still hung in the air as the wounded were carried into the palace halls. Soldiers groaned as healers rushed to tend them, while the nobles gathered in uneasy silence. No one spoke of their laughter from the night before. Their eyes followed Ethan as he walked into the hall, his sword still in hand, its edge dark from the fight. His steps were steady, his breath calm, as though the storm outside had only sharpened the quiet strength within him. Queen Alara stood at the far end of the hall, her crown tilted slightly, her gown stained by the dust that had blown in from the courtyard. She looked at her husband, as if seeing him for the first time. The mocking words she had once thrown at him seemed to echo back at her, hollow and cruel. Around her, the nobles whispered in shock, unable to understand how the quiet man they had dismissed could fight with such skill and lead with such command. Ethan raised his voice, not loud, but clear. He ordered the generals to gather the soldiers again, to repair the gates and strengthen the walls. His tone carried no anger, only certainty. The men obeyed, moving quickly, for they had seen what his presence meant in the battle. The generals, who had once sneered at him, lowered their heads and followed his instructions. Word spread through the palace and into the city. The queen's husband, once thought weak, had stood against the invaders and turned the tide. People whispered his name with respect, their voices carrying through the streets. Children who had once pointed at him in silence now spoke of him as a hero. The city that had mocked him began to lean on the strength they had never noticed before. That night the enemy gathered again outside the walls. Fires burned in their camp, their shadows dancing against the dark hills. The defenders on the towers watched with fear, but when Ethan stepped among them, their fear lessened. He spoke softly, reminding them to hold their lines, to trust their shields, to believe that the enemy could be beaten. His words, though simple, carried weight, and the soldiers straightened their backs at the sound. When the attack came again, the night shook with the roar of war. Arrows filled the sky, striking shields and stones. The enemy pressed forward with ladders and rams shouting as they stormed the gates. The defenders wavered for a moment, but Ethan moved among them, his blade flashing beneath the torchlight. He fought not with wild rage, but with calm control, each strike cutting with purpose, each step guiding those beside him. Soldiers began to follow his movements, striking when he struck, holding firm when he called for patience. What had been a broken defense turned into a wall of steel. The enemy fell back again and again, unable to break the line. From the balcony above, Queen Alara watched in silence, her heart torn between pride and shame. She saw the man she had belittled stand as the true shield of her throne. Hours passed before the attack faded into the darkness. The enemy left bodies at the base of the walls, their shouts retreating into the hills. The defenders stood weary but alive, their courage restored by the presence of the man they had once ignored. Ethan lowered his sword, his face calm, his eyes steady. He gave quiet thanks to the soldiers who had stood with him, offering no boast, no claim of glory. When he returned to the palace, the nobles bowed their heads as he passed. Their pride had broken with the enemy's charge, leaving only respect in its place. Queen Alara stepped forward, her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to tell him she had been wrong, but the words would not come. Instead, she stood in silence. The same silence she had once mocked, now filled with a meaning she finally understood. Ethan did not linger. He walked past the throne, placing his sword upon the steps, and left the hall. The echoes of his footsteps followed, steady and strong, reminding all who heard them that true strength is not in loud words or sharp laughter, but in the quiet courage that rises when the storm is at its fiercest. The dawn after the battle was quiet. Smoke still rose from the fields beyond the city, and the smell of ash lingered in the air. The people of the kingdom woke slowly, stepping out of their homes to see if the world was still standing. They found their walls scarred, their streets marked by fire, but they also found hope, for the enemy had been driven back. Whispers spread quickly through the city. The queen's husband, the man once called timid, had stood with a sword and saved them. In the palace, soldiers lined the corridors, their armor dented, their faces weary. They looked up with respect when Ethan passed. Some bowed their heads, others placed a hand over their chest, not with ceremony, but with gratitude. They had seen him fight beside them, had heard his calm voice steady their fear, and they would not forget it. His quiet presence had carried them through the darkest night. Queen Alara sat on her throne, her crown set aside, her face pale with thought. She looked smaller now, not because her strength was gone, because she had been forced to see what she had missed for so long. When Ethan entered the hall, silence fell. The nobles who once laughed at him rose to their feet, their eyes lowered in shame. No one dared speak first. Ethan walked with calm steps until he stood at the center of the hall. He carried no sword now, only the quiet dignity that had always been his. He did not look for praise, and he did not demand it. He simply stood as he always had, steady and humble, though the room bent toward him with new respect. Alara rose from her throne. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words were slow to form. At last she said softly that she had been wrong. Admitted before all that, she had ridiculed the man who had saved her kingdom. Her voice carried not pride, but humility, and for the first time, her people saw their queen bow her head. Ethan's eyes met hers, calm and kind. He gave no long reply, only a small nod. His silence carried more weight than any speech could have. It was the silence of a man who needed no boasting, no recognition, because his actions had already spoken for him. That silence filled the hall, and every noble, every soldier, every servant felt it settle in their hearts. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. Gates were repaired, walls strengthened, and homes restored. The people worked side by side, their spirits lifted by the memory of their defense. Children played in the streets, acting out the battle with wooden sticks, pretending to be the quiet man who had turned fear into courage. Songs began to spread through the markets, songs not of the queen's glory, but of her husband's hidden strength. Ethan moved among the people without seeking attention. He helped where he could, lifting stones, carrying timber, guiding those who asked for advice. To him, it was no different than before. He did not see himself as greater than others. He simply did what needed to be done, quietly, as he always had. But the people saw him differently now. When he walked through the city, they greeted him with smiles and bowed their heads. Farmers brought him bread, children ran to his side, soldiers saluted with pride. He never asked for these gestures, yet they came all the same. He had become the symbol of the kingdom's courage, not through loud words, but through quiet action. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Ethan stood on the palace balcony. The land stretched out before him, scarred yet alive. Queen Alara joined him, her gaze soft, her voice gentle. She told him that his silence had been her kingdom's shield, that his calm had been their light in the storm. She confessed her shame for not seeing it sooner. Ethan listened without judgment, his hand resting lightly on the rail. He gave her no rebuke, only the same quiet presence that had always been his gift. The kingdom healed, and the story of the quiet husband spread far beyond its walls. Travelers carried it to distant lands, telling of the man who had been mocked, yet rose to defend all. His name became a lesson, a reminder that true strength is often hidden, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And so Ethan lived, not as a man of loud praise or shining crowns, but as a man whose silence had spoken louder than all the voices that once laughed at him.